Um, Good morning, ladies. My afternoon, your morning. Delighted that you can make our festival. I came across your work in lockdown. It was one of my most enjoyable books about the impact of where we bring up particularly very young children and the effect it's had on our society. Certainly one of the themes of the festival, apart from bringing people together and giving us some fun together, is the whole idea of how do we make a slightly better world. And your book fits right in there. So without much more of ado, I'm just going to leave you to make introductions, and I know you have a wonderful presentation for us. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, John. My name is Darcia Narvaez. You can call me Dr. Darcia. And my colleague is?
Hello, I'm Mary Tarsha. Happy to be with you today. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Notre Dame working with Dr. Darcia.
And we are really very pleased to be with you today. And we have a PowerPoint that we're going to put up, and then we'll talk through it and have time for questions every now and then or comments. So please do share those on the chat. And we will take about 80 minutes or so to do this. So, but we have several chapters, so you can come in and out. So I'm sharing the PowerPoint. So our title is Restoring Humanity's Promise, Nestedness and Indigenous Wisdom. So these are a bunch of ideas we've packed into this PowerPoint and this presentation to give you a taste of where we think humanity needs to go and returning actually to the way we lived in the past, sustainably and wisely, virtuously. And so that's our discussion today. So we have several chapters here. We have the current situation we'll focus on briefly here. I think all of you understand that. You feel it in your bodies, you feel it everywhere you look. And then how we got to this place where we are in such a dire straits, and then remedies. So we can look around the world at what's happening to people, and we can see that human ill-being is really spreading. And it's spreading in part through the globalization that's forced on societies all over the world by unfettered capitalism, multinational corporations. And the United States is really a case in point, and we can see from a number of studies in all aspects of a human life that things are getting worse in the United States. And you maybe have noticed how kind of insane things are in the country and the inability to deal with meeting people's needs. So we have increased mental illness of various kinds, anxiety and depression in particular, violence, drug addiction, suicide. All these things are going up in the United States at all age levels. The lifespan is shrinking. Folks under age 55 are at a health disadvantage compared to 16 other advanced nations, and US child well-being ranks near the bottom of advanced nations. Now, the reason to bring up US data is because the US tends to export its ways to the rest of the world. For example, in how you birth a child and how you raise a child. And so that's why we think it's kind of a warning, extreme warning light here of being careful and remembering really how to raise a child well and to be flourishing and thriving instead of just keeping them alive, which even the US doesn't do very well. So even efforts to ameliorate the problems here often exacerbate the issue. Mary, did you want to say something, anything?
No, I think you summarized this really well. And we have some more slides after this kind of indicating exactly what we mean by the decrease in well-being in general.
So here's one figure of the somatic symptoms of depression in United States, 12th graders, those 18-year-olds or so. in the last decades, and you can see that things are increasing in terms of what they say they're experiencing. So the inability to sleep, that's the top line. Having a trouble thinking and concentrating, that's the second to the top line. Remembering, just memory, all sorts of things are just deteriorating. Learning capacities, and then the bottom one is shortness of breath. So we can see this is just one of many studies that could be demonstrating how the physical health and mental health among US children and all ages are deteriorating. And here is the cohort effects of poor health. And you can see that in the last years, the younger people are especially doing poorly. And then this last slide for this purpose here is the comparison among countries around the world with high social abilities, social wealth, and these kinds of middle income and middle well-being measures. So these are high, middle, and low well-being measures that are compiled by OECD and other agencies. And you can see around the world that things are getting more problematic with these different kinds of ways of putting together well-being. So you have the economic well-being that kind of sorts countries, but then you look at how are they doing out in every other case, and everything in terms of their mental health, physical health is getting worse across the world.
And I think one other thing about these slides is that, you know, oftentimes we are trying to tend to the symptoms, right? And that is important, but you know, what we're trying to do with our work is really get to the roots of the problems here, so that we're not just putting out immediate fires in the short term. And as we often said, many times that's just, you know, exacerbating the problem. We're trying to get to those root causes. So we'll talk about that in a few moments here.
Right. And often people say, well, you know, all these, look at how wonderfully economic development has occurred. You know, there are fewer poor people in the world. And that's the measure that's primary in people's minds. That's what we hear about in the news all the time. And, oh, if there's problems with the ecology or with mental health, that's just a side effect of improving economic wealth, as if that's the only thing that matters for a good life. So we would argue, and most people would if they think about the big picture, that economic wealth is just not the core of having a good life on the planet. So that's giving you our set of assumptions. I often start my talks with conveying how my assumptions are that we want to promote well-being in every age. And it really starts in early life because that has long-term effects. And that should be the primary goal of our societies and our families. So if we look at what's happening to Earth, there's just a sampling here of things that are going on. We are destroying our habitat, humans are, unlike any other animal. The Earth systems are breaking down in every way. If you look at the charts, everything's going off the chart. We're at several tipping points for such things as acid in the oceans, for example. And there's climate instability, global warming, melting of ice caps. All these reports keep coming out. So there's massive ecological disruption from human activity virtually everywhere. And this is from the Millennial Eco Assessment from 2005. And then at the same time, we have poisoning of soil, air, water, animal bodies, our own bodies. We've got what, 95 plastics or something in our bodies if you take a blood sample. And then the visible wildlife is decreasing. In the last 40 years, 50% of species have presumably been exterminated. gone extinct. So there's something quite wrong that what we're doing and the way we've focused our societies is destroying our ability to keep our species going and many other species.
And all of them are connected. And so when we talk about well-being and we talk about the earth and then how the degradation of the environment, all of this influences our physical and mental health as well, right? They're all reciprocal and dynamic and interacting, and it's very complex. So these first few slides, it's the bad news, you know, of what I think most of us know, but helping us understand the global picture.
And here's a chart just to show the global average temperature of the Earth. You can see that it's really skyrocketing now in the last 10 years, 20 years, and it's just continuing to go in the wrong direction. Some people had hoped that the shelter-in-place orders with the COVID pandemic, that might have an effect on the average temperature. And there was some evidence of decreased smog and such, but not really much deterrence to what's contributing the carbon that's being put in the air, for example. So anyway, so here we are. And so what we work on is multiple levels. So this is the big picture level, right? Look at what humanity's doing, how humanity's doing overall in their well-being. And we relate that then back down to the beginning of life. And we'll talk about that shortly. So are there any questions or comments at the moment? You probably all have your stories about how things are going in your own life and in your own area of landscape. Mary, are you able to see the chat?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
All right. So we'll go on. There'll be other chances to have questions or comments. We wanted to show you these beautiful pictures of animals, our fellow species too.
After all the bad news, there's something beautiful to look at for a few moments.
I love that, yeah.
These dolphins were shot in the canals of Venice, I assume.
Perhaps. All right, we'll go on then to, let's see. So our chapters, we've talked about the current situation, and now what led us to this point and what are the remedies we'll get to later. Noam Chomsky, nice quote here that leads us into our next chapter. The grim prognosis for life on this planet is the consequence of a few centuries of forgetting what traditional societies knew and the surviving ones still recognize. This must be one of our highest values, or we are all doomed. Okay, whew. Pretty strong statement. Of course, he always makes lots of strong statements. Unfortunately, he always seems to be right. Ah. All right, so what does that mean? So what is that pathway? What has been forgotten? What do sustainable indigenous societies, what has been known in the past that we have forgotten, and what do they have to teach the modern world? So let's
I love this question because, you know, when we approach the problem from this perspective or this lens, we're widening our perspective, again, like I said in the beginning, rather than just looking at how can we tend to the symptoms. And then often we fall into the same mindset that perpetuated and brought about the problem from the beginning. But when we expand our lens to say, wait a minute, I think we need a different way of thinking, a different way of understanding, so that we don't repeat the same thing or exacerbate.
Right, and it takes a transdisciplinary orientation to really solve the problems we're facing. You can't be in a silo and just look at one piece and then try to fix that, because it's all interrelated, as Mary has said. And so we are taking a big scope, widening the lens to understand how we got here so that we can actually do things to remedy where we are. So one of the main lessons and main understandings prior to the last few hundred years, essentially, is that we belong to the earth. The earth doesn't belong to us. And Jack Forbes has a great little quote here I'll read. "The fact of our absolute, utter, complete dependence upon the earth is used by native teachers as a part of self-understanding. For example, I can lose my hands and still live. I can lose my legs and still live. I can lose my eyes and still live. I can lose my hair, eyebrows, nose, arms, and many other things and still live. But if I lose the air, I die. If I lose the sun, I die. If I lose the earth, I die. If I lose the water, I die. If I lose the plant and animals, I die. All of these things are more a part of me, more essential to my every breath than is my so-called body. So what is my real body?" So I think we have to take into account this indigenous perspective to realize where we have to shift, right? Because we all kind of live inside of human-built environments, and we forget that we're reliant on the earth to keep us alive. So belonging to the earth is the indigenous worldview. And there's several books here that can be referred to: The Sacred Tree, Returning to the Teachings. Go through some of these perspectives, and I've written elsewhere about it too, with 4 Arrows, a colleague of mine. So what else is part of that indigenous worldview? Well, nature's alive. Everything is sentient, has some form of consciousness. This was common even in Europe before the last few hundred years, that nature is a partner, that you must honor and respect nature, the particular entities in your landscape, the tree, the river, the mountain, as part of your bio-community, part of your community responsibility to pay attention to their well-being as well. And to live well is to live in harmony with cyclical nature, to understand the seasons, to not work against them, but work with them and adjust to the landscape, adjust to the seasons, instead of trying to manipulate them, which is what our Enlightenment science has pushed us into doing, as if it doesn't matter that we're on the earth, right? That we could be living on the moon and we still act in these strange counter nature ways. But the native mind and the indigenous worldview is a mind in relational activity, always aware of the web of life. Everything you do and say and however you act is affecting the whole web. And that you are a mind in community, because the community members are also affecting how you are if you're receptive to that community.
I think one of the beautiful things about the indigenous worldview is also, contrary to maybe dominating nature or looking at how we can control and dominate nature, it's also about learning from nature. Right? So being in relationship is also seeing how we can learn even from the smallest of creatures or the smallest of plants, recognizing that. And that really is a form of humility, right?
Yes, humility is really important. So the nature of reality here, I'll move a little more quickly, is that everything is interrelated, part of a single whole. It's possible to understand something only if we understand how it's connected to everything else. And there's the material, physical manifestation of reality, but there's also the unmanifest, the things you cannot see that you have to use other, more intuition and other kinds of senses beyond the physical ones we usually talk about to understand it. So there's separate laws that govern each of these realms, and if you violate them, it can affect the world in various ways, and that we are spiritual as well as physical beings, and a balanced life then honors the laws of the spiritual realm and the physical realm. Now we've sort of neglected that in the Western scientific worldview, and I think that is an area to fix, I guess. Our fundamental duties then are to perceive interconnection to others always, to humans, to other than humans, to dedicate ourselves. This is the virtue of the indigenous worldview. We dedicate ourselves to connecting and caring in respectful ways in every instant and activity. So this is deep virtue, I guess. We talk about deep ecology is this awareness, but this is deep virtue then. So native science also is more encompassing that plants, animals, and other entities are partners. They're not resources. They're our relatives, actually. And sustainability, durability is based on reciprocity and not using risk assessment analyses. Conservation is based on respect and responsibility, not, again, this cost-benefit, resource-based economics. And instead, there's a mutualistic reciprocal exchange, which is what nature's economy is all about. Some animal, their waste becomes food for another animal, and there's this cycle, nature's economy, constantly. And when you establish private property, for example, that stops that flow of exchange. So you put up barriers to exchanging, and that's a whole big conversation too. So shifting indebtedness was normal until capitalism came in and started to charge people and make indebtedness of neighbors to be controlled. So there's a lot there. I'm going to keep going though. So I guess, so plants and animals, I think this is actually a similar slide. So let's go on. Blackfoot physics, indigenous knowing then is a vision of the world that encompasses the heart and the head, the soul and the spirit, and can really not deal with these in isolation. Then just like the theory of relativity, can't fragment space from time. And so when we do this, we're actually then disrupting normal flow of energy and being. The contrasting worldviews are on this slide. So you can see the dominant culture that we kind of are taught in school, that our early life experiences push us into, also is on the left side in purple. It teaches us that the world is fragmented, disenchanted, amoral. Only humans are really alive and have spirit, and only humans really matter. So there's anthropocentrism. We're the pinnacle of evolution or creation, whatever narrative that you pay attention to or we're taught. And we're very restless. We don't feel at home on the planet, and we conform landscapes to some abstract ideals, like the green lawns that America, the United States, has almost in every yard, you know, monocultural grass. That somehow we, you know, decide that that's more important than having a biodiversity lawn that feeds the pollinators, bees and butterflies. And then we hoard things for us, for humans, you know, exterminate those pests that keep coming into our food supply, whatever it is. So it's a very much a human-centered way of living. Whereas in the indigenous perspective, spirit pervades everything. And we're all mutually related. We're actually, humans are the younger siblings of mosses, for example, are 400 million years old. So you have much to learn from these other entities that are much, have been around much longer than the human species, which is about 6 million years at the most. And in the indigenous perspective, you make your place, you feel at home on the landscape where you are, where you're born, where you live, is your home. And you feel connected and rooted there, and you fit in with the local landscape and the bio community. You're not manipulating them, you collaborate, you partner with them, and you reciprocally share.
And I think, you know, now there's a conversation here within the US, you know, about this cultural homelessness that we're experiencing. It's really getting to the root of a disconnection, a lack of attachment to the place where we reside. And I think the Indigenous worldview also offers us, you know, a chance to understand they have a constant awareness of the consequences of their actions, you know. So in this way, it's a higher consciousness, right? Because they're aware of what they do, how it affects the larger system. And they are able to understand that because they are in relationship with the ecosystem. And so if you're not in relationship with the ecosystem, then you're not aware of how, you know, my particular choices and actions then affect the system at large.
Yeah. So The dominant view of nature today then is this, that nature is inert, it's just physical elements, and it should be controlled. It should be controlled by individuals seeking private economic gain, and that controlling nature for gain results in progress. All these things are contrary then to the indigenous worldview, and Carolyn Merchant documents the history of how this worldview developed in the last few hundred years. And previously, the female Earth was central to organic cosmology, and it was really undermined by the scientific revolution of the West and the rise of a market-oriented culture, the consumerism that dominates our lives today. So how did we learn to assume this disconnection from nature on a personal level? So you can have these ideas and narratives, but we don't all believe in the stories that other people believe in, right? That, for example, white supremacism, you know, that anybody who's not white is either a suspect or dangerous or something. A lot of us don't believe that. So how is it that we get susceptible to believing a particular way of perceiving the world? That's the kind of thing that we examine in our lab. And we think the most important thing to remember is that we inherit many things beyond genes, all sorts of things, cooperation and mutualism. These are not passed on through genes. Our physiology, body plan, cell design, these are things that genes don't control. Our capacities for self-organization, our community ecologies that the prior generations have left us, culture. And what we focus on in our lab is the developmental system for nurturing the young. And this is where we think that it shapes the mind of that individual, the psyche, to be oriented to particular narratives over others. And what we've done then is we disconnect the young from the kind of continuum of life, something that Jean Liedloff talked about in the continuum concept. We disconnect them, and then they have to latch on to some story that helps them explain why they feel so dysregulated and so disconnected. So let's go on then to our next chapter, the remedies of a nested childhood. And we have the evolved nest, and we're going to go through these pieces quickly and what that means to have a childhood that is actually fulfilling, that actually leads you to blossom, to open up your uniqueness. These are the aspects of the evolved nest we see in our ancestral context. It's only the last 1% of our history as a human genus that we've been in agricultural settled societies. Before that, we were in hunter-gatherer societies, and these are the characteristics that have been documented in those societies that still exist today. These are what fulfill the promise of human potential.
Yes, and when we talk about that, we talk about thriving and flourishing, you know, just to be clear, we're talking about, you know, this in every capacity. So not just being able to successfully pay your bills, right? It's not just an economic factor, which we understand that's important. But, you know, this is having experiences of deep joy and healthy relationships and nourishing relationships. And this is about children and adults personal flourishing in these ways, but also intellectual capacities, right? It's helping children also be intellectually creative and curious and just alive in every way. So I just wanted to set that out. So this is the good news, the part. So the first 2 chapters is very difficult, but here it's a very hopeful understanding of what we can do going forward.
Right, thank you. So it's good to understand, important to understand who we are, we're hominids, and to look at how immature we are at birth. So you can see the left column has our cousins, gorillas, orangutans, chimps, bonobos, and humans at the bottom. And across the top, it has columns giving us the information about the length of gestation, how much time in the womb each of these species has, and then the brain volume at full term birth, how much percentage of the adult brain is there at full-term birth, and that means for humans 40 to 42 weeks. Most kids aren't allowed to stay in the womb that long anymore. And then the eruption of first last permanent teeth, which are indicators of cognitive and physical development. And then the average length of nursing or breastfeeding. And then the general completion of physical growth, although we know the neuroscientists tell us, you can see there for humans it's 20 years, but the neuroscientists tell us about 30 years for the brain. I think the brain keeps growing though through adulthood, so I may have to revise that too.
Mm-hmm.
So gestation, you can see for humans is quite long. Look at how long it is. And then the brain volume though is smaller because we have so much growing to do after we're born. And then look at that first and last tooth eruption. You can see how much longer it takes us in many ways to reach our cognitive shifting at around age 6. That's why a lot of kids are sent to school at that time, because it's been noticed that kids shift in their ability to take in information and such. And then the nursing, the breastfeeding, you can see, look at that, 4 years on average for our species, which shocks everybody. What? 4-year-old nursing or breastfeeding? Oh my God. And you can see the range, 2 to 8 years that's been observed in these small band hunter-gatherer societies. So that's really why? Because the breast milk is this magical kind of formula. Sorry, it's not a formula. Magical
Nutrients.
Nutrients are full of all the things that are needed to build a good brain and body. The immune system, the neurotransmitters of the brain to make you intelligent and not depressed. All that is, and the brain takes so long and the body takes so long to develop, as you see. You need breast milk for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important slide because it really is reiterating that so much development is taking place after birth. You know, the human infant is so immature, the brain as an infant in the first few years of life. And so it's so important to receive a good nurturing environment because that shapes how the brain develops. You know, within the first year of life alone, the brain doubles. I mean, you can see this if you've ever, you know, been around an infant or a child, just the massive growth that takes place. And I like how you always say, Darcia, too, in other places that, you know, a human baby doesn't look the same, you know, at birth versus a year later, 18 months later, right? Compared to other species, it really is looking more like a smaller human version at 18 months, right? It takes so long to really develop. So maybe you can say something about that.
Right, so we really look like fetuses. We look like fetuses till about 18 months of age compared to other animals. That, you know, the skull bones don't fuse until around that time because our species evolved to expect lots of massive brain growth, and so you don't want to have a skull that's already hardened. So there's lots of brain growth that's supposed to be happening after birth, and various other things. So babies really need at that time, for those 18 months, an external womb experience, exterogestation. This is Ashley Montagu's term. And that is where you keep the baby calm as much as possible so that the biochemistry of the brain and body is in optimal condition for promoting growth. If you stress out that child, which we'll talk about too, you actually are inhibiting growth. And so the brain will not grow as large as a child who's supported. So let's look at that. What does that mean? Here it is. Children are born 9 to 18 months early. And Mary, did you want to talk about this? You want to go on?
Yes, I think what's interesting too is they're developing, but as you talk about here, the brain has the left and right hemisphere, right? I think we're all familiar with that. But what is so interesting is that in infants and in children in the first few years of life, the hemispheres aren't developing at the same rate, right? So it's asymmetrical. So the right brain is actually developing faster than the left brain. And so this is really important. We'll talk about this later, of how to really nurture the right brain so that it develops well. And this is your emotions and links to self-regulation, which we'll talk more about. But you can see this within a developing infant, that when they're crying or when they're experiencing emotions, they're experiencing them at a very intense capacity, right? So this is why it's so important to care for them and nurture them.
Yes, and so we particularly, as a species, are plastic in those early days, years, and a lot of epigenetic things are happening. That means the genes are being turned on or off based on the experience. So if you have a nurturing nest, the nestedness we'll talk about, you're going to turn on the genes to control anxiety, to be smarter, to be, less depressed, or whatever it is. We're just discovering what all this means. There's just hundreds, maybe probably thousands, maybe millions of genes that are being turned on or off from the experience the child has. So it really, really matters how you treat that baby.
And we know, there's emerging research that's just, fascinating about how, we're talking about epigenetics here, about how these experiences have the power to turn genes on or off in the early years of life, and how sometimes these carry lifelong consequences, right? So that turning the right genes on at the right time developmentally is critical, for example, to prevent and protect against developing anxiety disorders and learning deficits, down the road. And so this is why it's so important to provide nurturing, responsive care so that we can be helping turn the right genes on at the right time.
Yeah, and there's sensitive periods for this.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just suddenly have breast milk at age 30 and make up for not having it when you were a baby, for example, which is kind of a disgusting example, maybe, I don't know. But okay. Go ahead, Mary.
Yes, so we see that because the brain is so immature at birth and developing so rapidly, then we see that caregivers are really co-constructing the brain and the body of the child. And this is taking place at all different levels, right? Within the brain, the higher brain, the midbrain, and the lower brain. And this, leads to the capacities which are critical for flourishing and thriving later on. And we see that caregivers, parents and other caregivers, they can establish this type of synchrony and this physical and social communication, especially with this picture here, through the caring and the nursing, that there's this resonance that's taking place. And through that, the infant develops optimally, and putting them on a trajectory for wellness in every capacity.
Yeah, one of the most studied aspects of having a caregiver co-construction is attachment, and every baby goes through an attachment, setting up attachment. And when you have the positive kinds of experiences that we'll talk about, you develop secure attachment. And when you have less positive ones, where the caregiver is less consistent or actually unresponsive, right, you develop insecure attachment. And that's actually engraving your brain for social interactions for life, unless you get therapy later. And so then it's related to all sorts of things that aren't so helpful if you have insecure attachment. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things about attachment is that, when the infant and the child feels stress or feels distress, then they're able to communicate that, and then the caregiver responds. And so there's this pattern of, I have a problem, I have a need, and then it's fixed and it's satiated. And so this is the internal working model that the infant and child develops later on. So then when they grow up and face challenges or stress, they're able to lean into those relationships around them in order to receive the calm and the care, versus if you're missing that and lacking that, when a stressor comes later on, you're going to withdraw, right? Or maybe become anxious, maybe even become aggressive. And these are not going to calm you down. It's just going to exacerbate your stress and your anxiety. So all of this is developing unconsciously, really, within the first few years of life.
So there's a constant interaction between nature and nurture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I love this slide because it talks also about emotions and cognitions together. So Darcia, can you tell us a little bit about that? You spoke a little bit about how in the Indigenous worldview, there's not a separation here, but that these are really intertwined. So you can help us understand what this means.
Well, most of the societies of the world talk about heart-mind, that you feel with your mind and think with your heart, kind of ways to say it, so that your intuitions about how the world works and what's good is actually developed by your immersed experience. And that means these emotions and cognition and your action capacities are all intertwined. So when you're immersed as a baby in a world of empathy and resonance with welcome, kind of a reverence that your parents and caregivers attend to you and honor you and take your perspective and are a companion to you, you're going to develop that way of being in the world. And it's emotion based way of thinking that you carry with you. It's a subconscious implicit worldview then about how the world works. So if you're left alone and left in distress a lot, you're going to be distrustful of the world and not flexible or attuned, unlike the child who is nested in the ways that we talk about in a moment.
Yeah, and can you say a little bit, I know other places you've talked about, I love how you describe it simply but so powerfully about bracing, against
Right.
the world versus
Yes.
open-hearted. And I mean, I've seen you other times present, and there's always a moment where the audience is like, oh my God.
Right, well, we are going to come to that in a little while. So maybe I'll hold off. That's a teaser. A teaser. So
Stay
then,
tuned.
right. Do you want to keep going, Mary?
Sure. And so we see that we are biopsychosocially formed. And so it's a very long technical word, but what that means is that our biology and our psychology are formed socially through the experience between the environment and the type of care we received and what's happening physically and neurobiologically. And so we have these different capacities that take place, as Darcia alluded to on the other slide here, that when we receive the care that we need, we develop moral capacities such as empathy, compassion, and cooperation, in addition to social capacities, which are perspective taking and sociality, getting along with others. And there's a line there on the slide because there is this alternative view that suggests, really we're hardwired for violence and selfishness and aggression, and this is just the way it is. But we know that there is mounting evidence from neuroscience and developmental psychology, ethnographic research, and even theology like Desmond Tutu that counters this claim that says, no, we're not hardwired for these things. There's no evil baby, but that it is the type of care that we receive that is in shaping these capacities to live well with others. So then the question emerges, what capacities are present at birth, right? And so we know this is the work of Jaak Panksepp, the famous affective neuroscientist that just did so much work here on demonstrating that there are 7 systems within the brain, and we know that these systems, that several of these systems are present at birth, such as fear, panic, and anger, and that these socio-moral capacities are experience dependent, so that they're co-constructed in early life when the brain is malleable. And these include things like engagement and communal imagination. And then we have these higher order capacities such as sociality. And we think of the fear, panic, and rage as these lower order capacities, and these higher order capacities are things like sociality. And we need the frontal cortex and the higher part of our brain well developed so that we can calm fear, panic, anger, and rage systems within the brain. And so, you know, I love this slide because I think we can't underscore this enough, that there's just so much evidence here that the dynamic environment is what shapes human nature. So we're not hardwired for this, but that it's through this dynamic process. And we know this because we have, you know, as scientists, we want evidence, and we want evidence from the lab. We want evidence through random control trials, and we have that. But we also have evidence evolutionary, taking a larger perspective. And when we look at ethnographic research, we can widen the lens and see that we actually have, you know, thousands of years of evidence that show us a different story rather than this hardwired for violence and aggression. And we see this by examining small band hunter-gatherer communities. Maybe Darcia, you want to say a little bit about this?
Well, these communities are still in existence. They're still in existence, except they're under duress, of course, from globalization. And but they have been examined by anthropologists more scientifically, and their ways of being summarized in various publications. First-hand reports of diaries of the Europeans coming to the Americas also confirm some of the what's been studied and published. And we will talk a little bit more about them, but we use them as a baseline for how to optimize what's normal developmental supports, and what does an optimal human being look like.
So, and also here, when we're talking about the evidence here, you know, you have the 95 to 99% of human genius. So can you explain what that means?
Yes, so it's only the last 1% of human genus existence, the last 10,000 years or so, that's been, well, at least agriculture came into existence. It was often fought against. People don't like to have to work so hard like a farmer. It's much easier to be a hunter-gatherer, actually, contrary to people's perceptions, I think, and what they're told. So it's only the last 1% that agriculture has taken over and then often forced on people. Anyway, that's a long conversation. But so the 95 to 99%, depending on how you count, when we started as a genus, which aspect, Homo sapiens sapiens, or before that, that's why there's a range there.
Mm-hmm. So Darcia, you want to talk to us about this slide?
Yes, so we actually are a evolutionary developmental moral psychology lab, and we focus on moral development. So that means the compassionate morality and what supports that kind of, and what helps communities flourish. That's our baseline assumption about what we should be doing. And so when we provide what babies need, we think that's an ethical position, an ethical society, an ethical family. And when we deny what babies need, that's actually an unethical way of raising children. And so we'll tell you about what we think is the ethical. So first, what happens when you don't provide the developmental system that a species has developed over millions of years? And our system, our nest, is 30 to 40 million years old by and large, because it's a social mammal nest. What happens when you don't provide that? So we're going to just talk about that first before we get into the nest. So if you don't provide the species typical developmental system, then you have an atypical developmental system. It means the individual is not going to exhibit the normal range, the species typical range of intelligence and effectiveness. And that means you're going to have a species atypical outcome. So that's what we think is happening in the United States and more increasingly around the world, where you have children under cared for, and then they cannot develop because of all these sensitive periods that we've mentioned. They don't develop then the self-regulation capacities, the empathy capacities, the ability to get along cooperatively. And then the problem is, though, is that scholars think, well, that's the way people are, right? They're selfish and aggressive, and that's just, but they forget that actually those people they're looking at didn't have the typical developmental system. And so we can see that in research, usually it's retrospective of traumatized or neglected children, that all sorts of systems are affected. So the stress response, the immune system, as we said, these are all shaped in those early years, and they can also then be undermined by trauma later as well, like PTSD will shift your stress response, for example. So neurotransmitters, emotion systems, we've mentioned the corpus callosum, the brain area that connects the two halves of the brain, can be thinner than in neglected children, and then that leads to the inability to integrate emotion, feeling, and states, and you can flip between them. And we call then what happens when you don't have what we call the nest is undercare. But all these kinds of problems can happen from abuse, neglect, or trauma as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about, we have a neuroimaging slide here with like a normal brain on the left, and then we see a child, 3-year-old, of neglect, right?
Right, on the right. Yeah, so there's a 3-year-old brain. You can see then that the normal brain grows properly, and as we said, 90% by age 5. But it needs to have the right experiences to grow, and then the neglected brain just doesn't grow because it doesn't have the right biochemistry for its growth, doesn't have the right resonance with the caregivers that enhances and encourages the growth of all sorts of systems. And this is sort of, this image is of a neuron and its connections. On the left side, normal neuron in the middle there, the body of the neuron, and then is connecting to other neurons. And on the right is an image of a less well-developed or a toxically stressed brain where the synapses have disappeared or melted.
Yes, and so we see, more connections, and better connectivity typically leads to, right, the ability to have behavioral outcomes that are healthier, right? And so you can visually see the deprivation, right, at this level.
Right. So it's multiple level aspects of development that we are interested in.
Right, so the brain, not only the volume of the brain, right, is influenced, but also the connections between the brain. And so it's even more complex than that, but those 2 slides are just to summarize a lot of neurobiological literature saying that it's not only its volume and how much it grows, but even the actual connections are very different between kids who have received this care that they need versus undercare.
Good. And so this slide is a basic diagram of how the brain can function, the global brain states. And you can see we're born with those survival systems, as Mary said earlier, and they're linked to the stress response of fight, flight, freeze, faint. And so with a good, and then you have the mammalian, so this is Paul MacLean's Triune Brain Theory. It's more complicated than this, but it's helpful because it shows you how we can shift into global states that affect our actions, our perceptions, our attention. And the mammalian aspect here is grown after birth, the sociality, our ability to get along. Sorry for the typo there. Our systems, emotion systems of care and play, are fostered then by how much we are cared for and play with others. And then the human executive functions are the more recently evolved aspects of our brain, also grown postnatally, how well they function. And it's our ability to abstract, imagine, but also interact with the other systems. And so a good early life experience leads to the ability of these executive functions to control those survival systems, so that if when needed, right? So if all of a sudden you see a big shadow in your room, you think, oh my God, it's a monster after me. Your stress response kicks in and you go, oh my God, and you get all worried, but then you realize it's a shadow. And you're able then with the executive functions to just calm yourself down quickly. It's not a big deal. And what we notice from the small band hunter-gatherers, our baseline society and how they operate, they spend most of their time here in this sociality, care and play with one another. And when they use their imagination, it's with the community in mind. You know, this is after childhood development. So anyway, that's how a well-functioning brain will operate. And what happens when early life is toxic, that means you are left alone to cry, you're left alone to sleep, you're punished, you're spanked. That's all toxically stressful for a growing brain, and it's going to lead then to what we call a self-protection disposition, because once the stress response kicks in, you just want to run, or you want to do, it's all about you, right? And what happens too then is the brain it doesn't develop properly, and this stress can just take over your mind, and you see that shadow come in the room, and then you realize it's just a shadow, not a monster. It takes you forever to calm down because the systems were not developed well to help you quickly shift out of that mindset. And so you end up in this panic state, or this angry state, or this fearful state, and it's so hard to get out of that. And in the undercare for nest, undercared for experience, the mammalian aspect, your sociality just doesn't grow as well because you're spending so much time in panic or fear that you don't have this playful orientation, or you don't feel empathy and love and reverence from the others around you, and you don't develop it in yourself. So this is what happens then is in each situation, you come to the situation and you decide whether you're going to be engaged on the left side there, whether it's a safe place to be. And when you feel safe, you're going to be open and feel rewarded by social experience. And then that can also happen from what you think about the situation, that top-down part. I'm just looking at the left side of the diagram. That if you think, oh, these people, I like these people, and it's safe to be with these people, then you're going to put yourself in that safe mode. So this neuroception occurs so quickly in each situation. So the bottom-up part down there happens instantaneously when you arrive in a situation. And if you feel, the green, you were told that green people were dangerous, and you need a green person, your top-down story is going to put you in this defensive mode. And you're going to feel unsafe. People who are undercared for, whose brains aren't very self-regulated, are going to feel unsafe a lot, just because being with others feels scary. And so they'll go into this other mode on the right. And we could say more, but probably have to keep going. Mary, do you have anything?
No, I think that this is good. So this is to use the hand motions. This is the bracing. Right?
Yes, that's it.
This
right.
slide. So if you want to say something about that.
Okay. Right. So the engagement side is that openness. It's like, so I have my students practice, open your arms and your hands and embrace the world kind of orientation. And the right side, the safety or defense one, is the bracing against the world. Either you're going to fight them or you're going to withdraw, right? So those are the modes that you spend a lot of time in if you've been undercared for and haven't had the nurturing that we're going to talk about finally in a moment.
Yes, and also you're talking about narratives, right? How narratives shape these different things, and these what we've been told and how we internalize that, but also embracing not only individuals, but just to reiterate, it's the world itself. So the world is a good and safe place. This is one understanding, versus the world is to be feared and protected against, and every day I have to go out there and, brace myself. So these are the two different worldviews that become internalized.
And we can see recent police action in the United States where they are actually killing unarmed Black people, that they're in this safety mode. They're in the warrior mode. It's not safe. I'm gonna, this guy turned around and looked at me. I'm gonna shoot him. Right. So they've been taught, or that, we don't know. It may be the people who are attracted to being a police officer are undercared for, and they have this mindset, and being a police officer is a way to feel safe in general. So anyway, we better go on though. So what is it that healthy societies need? What does that mean? This means that you provide the species typical developmental system. You're going to have smart, effective creatures, which is a species typical outcome. There aren't any stupid animals out there once they're given what they evolved to need. They're going to be smart and effective. That's just the way the world works. And we have a nest like all animals. And what does it look like when we are highly functioning? Darwin noted the moral sense in human beings were capacities that accumulated through the tree of life. And these include social pleasure, just enjoying being with our conspecifics, our fellow human beings, having empathy for them, remembering what we promised to do in terms of fitting into the cooperative community and doing it, and assessing how well we did, and modifying ourselves, changing our habits, being concerned for how people think about us, all those kinds of things. We could also add from the examination of small band hunter-gatherers this sense of higher consciousness, of being connected to the ecological self, a common self that's connected with the natural world all around us. And we can see that nomadic foraging people, the small band hunter-gatherers, display these characteristics. Elsewhere, I've published on how these things seem to be diminishing in the United States. Mm-hmm. All right, so
when we talk about small band hunter-gatherer communities, and as Dr. Darcia just showed the slide before, these amazing outcomes of intelligence and connectedness and just overall general well-being, these are the outcomes we're looking at. We then see, how did they get this way? How are their adults and children this way? We see that they practice a type of ecological caregiving system that is listed here. And this is what we're going to go into more detail. And it is called the Human Evolved Developmental Niche. And before we talk about how small band hunter-gatherer communities provide for their children, it needs to be emphasized that this is not a list of 9 things that parents need to do, like just a laundry list to add to your things to do today, but rather this is a way a whole community provides for children and cares for the children. And many of these practices, as Darcia has said earlier, are 30 to 40 million years old because they're mammalian practices that have developed. So starting with number 1, it's soothing perinatal experiences. So this means that, as we talked about before, the brain is so vulnerable, especially when it's after birth, but particularly when it's in utero. When the mother is stressed, this influences the child in very negative ways. And there is a lot of emerging research coming out here that we want to keep the mother calm and supported. And we see that, especially within the United States, unfortunately, this is undermined in many ways, just not giving respect and care for pregnant women. And then also at birth, there's not separation between mother and baby, and no painful procedures. Because this, yes.
We'll have to move along quickly.
Right.
So yeah, we'll have to keep going. But
yeah, all right.
So we are going to then just very quickly go through what we call also the evolved nest, right? Mm-hmm. So these are
Go ahead, Darcia, you want to talk about this one? I was beginning, but.
Yeah, well, we only have like 20 minutes left, so.
Because the time, it was just so fun. It's gone by
I
so
know, we're only
fast.
halfway.
I know. So,
Doing great.
Less than halfway.
yeah.
Huh?
Okay.
So,
all right, so we talked a little bit about this one. Maybe we can
yeah,
move
that's
on
right.
to the next
So
one.
let's go on, yep. And we
So
have
the next
breastfeeding
one. Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of things. We've mentioned already the importance of breastfeeding for lengthy.
Mm-hmm. Including higher IQ, larger brains, higher myelization of white matter. There's so much to be said about this, but in general, you know, it's feeding the brain with exactly what it needs when it needs it.
And building the immune system, which is the gut, and mostly in the gut as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, so it's much more than the intake of ingredients. Then we have positive touch, positive moving touch.
Darcia, you want to talk about this one?
Sure. So we actually need a touch to grow and synthesize DNA. And when we are left alone, our body actually slows down. The growth of the child slows down. Various things get dysregulated. And so when you separate a mammal baby, even for an hour, they've done experiments with horses and pigs and sheep, it can dysregulate them, that you don't see it later until adolescence maybe or something. They have trouble with getting along with others. So there's all sorts of other studies that have been done that shows that these lack of touch is related to violence and antisocial behavior, as well as depression. And we know that harsh physical punishment is particularly inhibitory of good development. Various studies now have documented the longitudinal effects of spanking children having a negative effect. I mean, it might look all right to the parent because the child stops doing whatever it is, but it's leads to more aggression, less well-being overall.
Yeah, 5 decades now, right, that we have. Yep.
Yes.
Of research on that.
Right, so it's really accumulating. And positive touch then has long-lasting health benefits, preventing excessive stress, building the oxytocin system well, preventing depression, promoting healthy sleep cycles, and all sorts of good things like that are listed here. And it turns out that positive touch is good for everybody. And there's been a lot of talk about that lately with the pandemic and the sheltering in place and people not getting touched enough. People can get depressed without it. So people have pets, a lot of pets. The humane shelters have gotten emptied from people adopting pets. Positive climate, that's the welcomingness of the social community to the child. The baby will feel welcomed when you honor its needs, and you promote more positive emotions and negative emotions in each other. So that would be increasing then your sense of security, of belonging, of feeling like you are one of the cherished community members. And these things are also very good for all ages. Self-directed social play. This is well established, important for all mammals, social mammals especially, to play. It builds emotion regulation, influences gene expression, fosters brain development, executive functions. So Panksepp, our friend, used to say that ADHD was actually probably a lack of play because of his studies, that kids who display ADHD are actually displaying a need for play, and some people need more play than others. So again, it's good for all ages. It helps your right brain grow. If you were not well cared for early, your right hemisphere didn't grow very well. Self-directed social play in the moment with young child can help grow that brain in an adult.
And Darcia, is this true even for adults?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yes. So adults can grow their right hemispheres by playing with, especially little kids, where you have to play chase or wrestling or something creative. Do you want to speak about this?
There's so much to say about this, but I think this is what we were talking about earlier, about how, you know, this hemispheres develop at a different rate. The right hemisphere is developing faster than the left brain, and play helps develop the right hemisphere. And so why is the right hemisphere so important? It's important because this is what controls self-regulation. It also controls intersubjectivity and also social pleasure. It's also responsible for emotional intelligence, empathy, a sense of beingness, transcendence, and just higher consciousness. So the right brain is important.
All right, so then we go on to allo mothers. These are allo parents, other mothers, other nurturers. So we evolved to raise children in a community, not a mother alone with a child, not a mother and father alone with a child in a house. That's just very conducive to ill-being for everyone. And mothers, we know, need support to care well for their children. And it's positive when they have support. It's positively related to children's social skills, mothers' mental health, so on. And we actually all of us need supportive mentoring throughout our lives. So this is really actually something for everyone to pay attention to. And so if we think about what policies support foster social support for families and children, the WHO has guidelines for women and children that are helpful here. So they emphasize responsive caregiving, early learning, integrating caregiving and nutrition interventions, and supporting maternal mental health. So these are things that are pretty basic that we would support as well. And then we have the responsive relationships. We talked about responsiveness earlier. This is the reciprocal communication, synchrony. And then when you get dysynchronous, when the communication breaks down, you repair it. And the child needs to learn how to repair the miscommunications, and that builds confidence and builds the brain in a way that's, more healthful. And there's mutual influence on the mother and the child, or the caregiver and the child influencing each other, and, like good friends in a way, building shared narratives, and always meeting the child's needs in the moment, especially when the child is young. And we all need responsive relationships too. We all want to have people who are listening to us and are confidants and are going to support us no matter what happens.
And we all need that repair, right? Because relationships aren't perfect. And so there is a rupture of synchrony or mismatch. And so we need those experiences to be able to say, I'm sorry, to forgive, to come back together. And that's so strengthening, right, for the relationship.
Yes. And the vagus nerve is one of the aspects of the body that you want to talk about it, Mary, quickly?
Yes, so this is very quick. It's one aspects that we study within the lab. So it's the 10th cranial nerve. So this is the nerve that is part of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So what that means is it's responsible for calming and restoring both the brain and the body, and it's responsible for giving you a feeling of safety, as we talked about, and it controls the systems of the heart and the lungs and digestive tract. And it too, I think we can go to the next slide, is shaped by early experience. And so we know that when you receive this responsive care in early life, that this vagus nerve becomes well regulated, meaning that you're able to calm yourself down when needed to, and you're also able to have the vagal brake, meaning you're able to take off that and you're able to engage. If something threatening does come, you're able to move away from that. So you're not just placid sitting there stunned. You're able to, take care of yourself and move away from the true threat that is there. So this is all part of healthy regulation. And it's through early experience of that nurturing responsive care that you have a well-functioning vagus nerve.
And so just interlude here, you want to speak about this too?
Yes, so these are some ways we wanted to suggest that we can implement the nest within families and within classrooms as well. And so we know that the importance of close physical nearness, even to trusted caregivers, right? So parents and caregivers that are close to their children in physical proximity, we see an increase in oxytocin, which is the love and bonding hormone, makes you feel so great and happy, right? Increases in children within as little as 5 minutes. So just being close to family members is really important. And here are some other practical suggestions, such as folk song games. Darcia, you want to say a little bit about this?
Sure, there's a lot of games out there you can find if you search for their videos and things. One of the famous ones that I think we all know is, at least in the Western Anglo-American world, is The Farmer in the Dell. But there's a lot of other ones that you can do that really are fun. I do with my students.
Yes. So those promote movement and positive social experiences and laughter and touch, and also just focusing on children's needs throughout the day with unconditional positive regard. And then this helps build communication within them to be able to communicate needs later on. And also so important to safeguard time for play, every single day if possible, with children and with families, as adults, play every day. And of course, if you can, it's best if you're outside in nature, and if possible for children with playmates of multiple ages.
So we want you to think, but we're not going to take time to let you answer, but we'd like you to think about your own life. What are ways that you can encourage responsive and sensitive care in these different aspects of the nest that we all need, actually? So let's go on to nature connection. This is something that's been more recently a concern. Richard Louve's famous book, Last Child in the Woods, pointed out some almost 2 decades ago, the importance of, that children are losing their connection to nature. He called it nature deficit disorder. And so it's really important. This is part of our heritage. We are creatures of the earth, and we need to feel that. As we mentioned earlier, the Indigenous Worldview is about promoting that sense of connection and responsibility and communication with the natural world. And we can all do this every day, just even looking at the clouds or the sky, the winds, the trees in the neighborhood, wherever you are, there is nature. And then healing practices. We need all of us to, because we make bad choices sometimes, or say put our feet in our mouth, I guess. We all need to mend our relationships and mend ourselves when things go off kilter. And so we need routine practices like meditation or other kinds of ways of healing one another and healing ourselves. I see this, and this is everyone can benefit. And I see this is out of order here, the nature connection. So things that you can do, and this is actually related to healing too for yourself. Being connected to nature is a way to calm yourself down. So walking, sunning, earthing now is like walking barefoot in the grass, things like that, or gardening, bird watching, hiking, camping. And then practicing ecological attachment, and that would be practicing gratitude towards the 4 directions for the sources of nourishment at your meal, whether the animals or plants, acknowledging the other than humans that you meet along the way as you walk outside, for example, the ants, the bees, paying attention to the weather and such, and minimizing harm. And these kinds of practices, we just published this paper, which you can get still if there's free access till mid-July, on a 3-week intervention we did with college students that increased ecological attachment, doing such activities like that. So we're going to skip the questions and comments. Isn't that a cute picture though? Be like that. And we have data, but we have maybe 6 minutes left. So I'm going to just flash through. Mary, is that right? So we've developed a number of measures, and one of them is how much has the child received the Evolved Nest in the last week? We ask caregivers to tell us. And these are the items we ask about: touch, positive touch, negative touch, play, free play outside and free play inside, and then family togetherness, inside the home and outside the home. Those 6 questions. And we ask also about home climate, but these are the ones that we now are looking at. So if you look on the left side of the diagram, you'll see the controls that we use: parent age, education, income, how responsive they are in general that they report, and child's gender. And then the bottom one, the one with the red line, that's the Evolved Developmental Niche provision. So how much of the nest they got in the last week that the mother is telling us. These are mothers, I think mostly mothers anyway. And then on the right side, you'll see that these are ways we measure moral socialization, empathy, internalized conduct, inhibitory control, and concern after wrongdoing in the child. So these are 3 to 5-year-old children. The mothers are asked about their behavior, the mother's behavior, and then the child's. You want to add anything, Mary? So that's a significant finding then, that the report of the nest in the last week, those asterisks, mean it's particularly significant. And this is United States data, and then I'll show you also then Switzerland. In Switzerland, this mattered less, but it was a very small sample. And then in China, it mattered. So we had samples from all 3 areas. And these are basic moral socialization measures that are used widely. Then we looked at poor social development. Again, the left side is the same sets of variables. And then on the right are the kinds of ways we ask the mother about their child. And we call this then social maladaptation altogether. And you can see that in the United States, it really mattered what kind of nest provision they had in the last week. And then I'm just showing you the USA data now. We also looked at what we called sociality. So that's that flexible, attuned enjoyment of others, thriving and happiness. You can see that on the right side, all the items, the kinds of measures that contributed to sociality. And then that double asterisks 20.22 indicates that the nest in the last week really mattered for that too. And I guess, oops, we found the same. Here's Switzerland, also had the nest. It really mattered for sociality. And then China here, this is China, also mattered. So for all 3 country samples, the last week's nestedness influenced then the child's sociality. So the last week's nestedness is a snapshot of what the child's normally experiencing. And then we've looked at adult data and asked about their nest history and their attachment and security. We ask them how securely attached they are. We ask about mental health. And then we look at whether they're their interpersonal capacities for perspective taking. You can see that there. And then the last one is, are they open to others, that open relational attunement, or are they bracing against others, right? And so we find that there are pathways through that. People with higher evolved nest history have higher secure attachment, better mental health, better perspective taking, and then are more relationally attuned. Or there's a couple negative pathways, so less of the nest, more insecure or less secure attachment, more anxiety and depression, mental health, ill health, and then more personal, either lower perspective taking and then oppositional protectionism, or more personal distress and a withdrawal orientation to being with others. So these are things that we predicted that did come out then. I've also written about the importance of possibly having a baby bill of rights and a mother's, so that follows the nest in many ways. And I think we're going to have to go on. So you can look at this if you pause the video and read it. And we're gonna, again, skip the questions and comments. We just are too talkative today. No time for that, but we wanted to mention the nested adulthood. Everything is, of what we've talked about, virtually everything is also important in adulthood. You need the nest throughout life. So we all need, just starting on the top there, positive touch, a positive climate of support from at home and at work, self-directed play, we need allo, we need mentors, responsive relationships, nature connection, and healing practices. And we've talked about, or I've written about, how important it is then to follow this cycle. This is our ancestral cycle, our heritage of how you build a cooperative companionship society. You start with number one there, the companionship caregiving, the nest that we've talked about. That fosters then number two, the good physio-neurosocial biology, which then leads to number three, the adults who have well-being and wisdom. And then they, in turn, number four, build a community that attends to basic needs and keeps the cycle going. And this is what we see in our heritage. And it's only in the last few hundred years that's particularly been disrupted. In the last, before that, a third of the globe was occupied by small band hunter-gatherers and other societies that practiced really the nest. And it's just in the last few hundred years that we've shifted away from commons, the life of the commons, and so on. So
and just even the nuclear family, Darcia, just the last 100 years,
yeah,
right?
Right.
Shifted, just looking at, you know, we lived with extended family members, and it's so only within the last 100 years that it's these single family households of just 2 adults and children.
Right. So in our sustainable 99%, and still in many First Nation communities, if they've been able to maintain traditions, then there's a multi-age social life. There's no central authority or formal leaders. There's fluid boundaries in communities. So in-group, out-group isn't really a big deal. High autonomy, individuals can come and go as they please. High solidarity at the same time, so with humans and non-humans, and a gift economy, which I mentioned. And they end up with small egos and large selves. So one other aspect that we wanted to mention, again, I think we did early on, is the importance of our stories, what narratives we tune into. David Corton has this book where he contrasts sacred. He says we're dominated by this sacred money and market story, and we need to return to the sacred life and living earth story so that we actually then meet basic needs instead of putting money's well-being at the primary focus, which unfortunately a lot of our globalized institutions are doing. We have to change our perceptions and realize that we share our DNA with all sorts of animals and plants even, and that 90 to 99% of the genes we carry are not human because of all those trillions of microorganisms that keep us alive. So we're really all cooperative communities, and we need to change our perceptions and understand that everything is dynamically interconnected, and quantum physics helps us do this. We're all in the web of life, and I write about traditional wisdom, primal wisdom. We need to return to the understanding that we need to be compassionate toward all of the natural world, and that alienation from being part of the world, our animal nature, is actually harmful. And so we can practice indigenous wisdom, moving with nature, not against it, and control that self-protectionism, prevent it from growing, and nurture instead relational attunement and communal imagination, so that we follow this upper kind of pathway to our original species typical outcome, rather than the species atypical outcomes that we're stuck in. We get out of this cycle of competitive detachment where we undercare for people at poor development, adults with ill-being, and a degraded culture. We're in that cycle right now, but we can change it. We can go back to this cycle because we can intervene at each point here, intergenerationally provide for basic needs, provide the evolved nest, support balance and healing, build narratives and intuitions that emphasize connection, and then all with the earth in mind, so that we become again those creatures that live sustainably and wisely with our biocommunities. So I will just flash these by, the summary slides, and thank you very much for your attention. Lots of books and things out there, and a lot more information that you can get. Look for us at evolvedness.org, and thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a most amazing talk. So many things to think about, so much to ask questions about, but I'm sorry we're completely out of time. I really appreciate you've done a ton of work. I'm going to have to go and say,
Yes.
say it's time for me to move on to another speaker. But we will make sure that this talk is widely circulated and that people are checking out the wonderful things that you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.